17 times. That's how many times Nancy Whitlow called the cops on my RV parked in my own driveway in 3 weeks. She even measured the noise level with her phone app at 2 a.m. when the RV had been turned off since 8 p.m. But Nancy didn't know I was keeping records too. And those records would eventually help me build something she'd have to stare at every single day for the rest of her miserable life. Drop a comment with your city, because this story proves that sometimes the sweetest revenge is 100% legal. Let me back up to the beginning. My name is Cal Harrington, and 6 months ago I thought I'd found paradise. After my divorce was finalized, I needed a fresh start somewhere peaceful. Pine Valley Estates looked perfect on paper. A quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and reasonable homeowner association fees. The house I bought had everything I wanted. 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, and most importantly, a wide concrete driveway that could easily accommodate my 32-foot Winnebago RV. I'd worked hard to afford that RV, and weekend camping trips were my main source of sanity after the divorce proceedings. The first few weeks were blissful. My neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving from their perfectly manicured lawns as I came and went. I settled into a routine, working from home as a computer systems consultant during the week, then hitting the road every Friday afternoon for adventures in state parks and campgrounds. Life felt good again. I should have known it was too good to last, because that's when I met Nancy Whitlow, the self-appointed queen of Pine Valley Estates and the most miserable human being I've ever encountered. It was a Friday evening in early September when I first laid eyes on her. I just pulled into my driveway with the RV, planning to load up supplies for a weekend trip to the mountains. I was backing the rig into position when I heard this shrill voice behind me, shouting, "Excuse me! Excuse me!" I shut off the engine and climbed down to see a woman in her late 30s marching across my lawn like she owned the place. She had cheap blonde hair that looked like it came from a box, and she was wearing a faded flower print outfit that screamed discount store clearance rack. But what really caught my attention was the clipboard she clutched in her hands like a weapon, and the oversized canvas bag slung across her shoulder that appeared to be stuffed with various measuring devices and folders. "I'm Nancy Whitlow, president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association," she announced, positioning herself between me and my front door like she was planning to block my escape. "And that," she pointed dramatically at my RV, "is completely unacceptable." I stood there for a moment, genuinely confused, because my RV was parked entirely on my own property, not blocking any sidewalks or streets. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" I asked politely. "The problem," Nancy said, pulling out her phone and taking photos from multiple angles, "is that recreational vehicles destroy the aesthetic integrity of our neighborhood. They make us look like a trailer park." I explained that I'd carefully reviewed the homeowner association documents before purchasing the house, and while there were restrictions on permanently parking RVs, there was nothing prohibiting temporary parking for loading and unloading. Nancy's face turned an impressive shade of red as she started digging through her bag, pulling out a measuring tape that looked like it belonged in a museum. "We'll see about that," she muttered, stretching the tape along the length of my RV while I watched in amazement. She measured from 3 different angles, took 47 photos, yes, I counted, and spent nearly 20 minutes documenting every aspect of my vehicle like she was investigating a crime scene. The whole performance was so absurd that I almost laughed, but something in Nancy's eyes told me this was deadly serious to her. There was a manic intensity there, like she'd finally found her life's purpose in harassing me about my RV. After she finished her documentation project, Nancy marched back to the sidewalk and turned around for one final declaration. "You'll be hearing from the Homeowners Association very soon, Mr. Harrington. This is just the beginning." She said those last words with such venom that I actually felt a chill run down my spine. Sure enough, the next morning I found an official violation notice tucked under my windshield wiper. The document was printed in Comic Sans font with several obvious typos, and it demanded immediate removal of my unsightly recreational vehicle from the premises. At the bottom, someone had handwritten in purple ink, "This is just the beginning." I stood there holding this ridiculous notice, wondering what exactly I'd gotten myself into by moving to Pine Valley Estate. I spent most of that weekend researching every clause and subsection of the Pine Valley Estates Homeowner Association contract. What I discovered was fascinating and infuriating in equal measure. The original covenant, written 15 years ago, contained exactly 3 sentences about recreational vehicles. They couldn't be parked permanently in driveways, they couldn't obstruct traffic flow, and they couldn't be used as permanent residences. Nothing about temporary parking for loading and unloading, Nothing about aesthetic standards, nothing that would prohibit exactly what I was doing. But Nancy had been busy over the years, apparently. Tucked away in meeting minutes from the past 3 years were dozens of clarifications and interpretations that Nancy had pushed through, often with barely a quorum present. She'd essentially rewritten the rules to give herself maximum power over every aspect of neighborhood life. The woman had transformed a simple homeowners association into her personal fiefdom, and I was her latest target. Monday morning, I was enjoying my coffee and planning my work schedule when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on my front door. Through the peephole, I could see Nancy standing on my porch with what appeared to be a police officer. My heart sank as I opened the door to find Deputy Brad Whitman, a tired-looking man in his 40s who was clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Sir, we've received a complaint about an illegal commercial vehicle parked in a residential area," he said, glancing apologetically at Nancy, who was practically vibrating with excitement behind him. I explained the situation calmly, showed Deputy Whitman my RV registration, insurance documents, and personal use records. Everything was completely legal and properly documented. The officer walked around my RV, took a few notes, and returned with a sympathetic expression. "Ma'am," he said to Nancy, "this is a privately owned recreational vehicle, properly registered for personal use. There's no violation here." Nancy's face went through several color changes before settling on an alarming shade of purple. "But it's commercial size," she sputtered. "It's destroying our property values." Deputy Whitman politely explained that vehicle size alone didn't determine commercial status, and unless there was evidence of business activity, there was nothing illegal happening. After the officer left, Nancy stood in my driveway for several minutes, staring at my RV like it had personally insulted her family. Then she pulled out her phone and started making calls. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught phrases like uncooperative neighbor and property value destruction, and we need to take action. Within hours, I started noticing subtle changes in the neighborhood dynamics. A few neighbors who had previously waved now looked away when they saw me. Someone left a passive-aggressive note on my windshield about community standards. The woman across the street actually crossed to the other sidewalk when she saw me coming. It became clear that Nancy was conducting a full-scale gossip campaign, painting me as some kind of neighborhood menace who was single-handedly destroying Pine Valley estates. She'd positioned herself as the heroic defender of community values, fighting against the inconsiderate outsider who dared to park his giant RV where decent people might have to look at it. The campaign was surprisingly effective. Within a week, I felt like a pariah in my own neighborhood. But Nancy wasn't content with just poisoning the neighbors against me. She escalated to what I can only describe as psychological warfare. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., she would emerge from her house with her clipboard and conduct what she called neighborhood quality inspections. This involved walking slowly past my house, taking photos of my RV from every conceivable angle, and making notes on her clipboard with exaggerated intensity. She measured tire positions, documented which way my RV was facing, and even started timing how long I spent loading or unloading gear. The whole performance was clearly designed to intimidate me, but it had an unexpected side effect. It was absolutely hilarious. Nancy had apparently appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial RV surveillance specialist, and she took the job with the kind of obsessive dedication usually reserved for rocket scientists or brain surgeons. She bought a noise measurement app for her phone, though she clearly didn't understand how to use it properly, because she kept getting readings from birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. My friend Megan Blake, who's a real estate lawyer, came to visit that weekend and immediately recognized Nancy's name. "Oh my God, Cal, I know exactly who that is," she said after I described my situation. "He was in the news about 2 years ago for harassing her neighbors in Riverside Hills. Got kicked out of her homeowners association position for targeting a family with a boat. Apparently this is her thing. She moves into a neighborhood, gets herself elected to the HOA, then picks one person to torment until either they move away or she gets forced out herself." This information was both enlightening and terrifying, because it meant Nancy wasn't just having a bad week or going through a difficult time. This was her actual hobby. As I watched Nancy setting up what appeared to be a tripod for better surveillance angles, I realized I had a choice to make. I could let this woman drive me out of my own home, or I could figure out how to fight back. The problem was, Nancy held all the institutional power. She was the HOA president, she had allies among the neighbors, and she was clearly willing to dedicate unlimited time and energy to making my life miserable. I needed a strategy that would work within the system she'd created, something she wouldn't see coming until it was too late. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I started keeping detailed records of every interaction with Nancy, every violation notice, every harassment incident. I documented her trespassing, her intimidation tactics, and her increasingly unhinged behavior. I didn't know exactly how I'd use this information, but I had a feeling it would come in handy eventually. As I watched Nancy setting up a camera system pointed directly at my driveway, I realized that if she wanted to play the long game, I was more than ready to oblige her. Nancy's harassment campaign entered a new phase the following week when she apparently decided that one police call per incident wasn't nearly enough. Deputy Whitman started showing up at my house with increasing frequency, each time looking more tired and more apologetic. Noise pollution complaint, he'd announce wearily, then spend 5 minutes documenting that my RV had been silent for hours. Report of oil stains on the driveway, followed by a thorough inspection that revealed my concrete was actually cleaner than most of my neighbors. Traffic obstruction allegation, which required him to measure the distance between my RV and the street, confirming what anyone with eyes could see. There was no obstruction whatsoever. By Thursday of that week, Deputy Whitman had visited my house 6 times. His coffee cup had grown progressively larger with each visit, and he'd started bringing what appeared to be a full thermos of espresso. "Look, Mr. Harrington," he said during visit number 5, "I want you to know that these complaints are unusual. In my 15 years on the force, I've never seen this level of focus on one neighbor's legally parked vehicle." He glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice. "Between you and me, you might want to start documenting these interactions. This level of harassment isn't normal." I assured Deputy Whitman that I was indeed keeping detailed records, including timestamps, photos, and his official reports. This seemed to relieve him considerably. "Good," he said, draining his coffee cup, "because if this continues much longer, those records might become very important." As he drove away, I noticed Nancy watching from her front window with binoculars. The woman had apparently decided that regular surveillance wasn't sufficient and had upgraded to military-grade neighborhood monitoring. The escalation I'd been dreading came on Friday afternoon when I received a notice about an emergency homeowners association meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. The agenda listed only one item: discussion and voting on proposed recreational vehicle regulations. I knew this was Nancy's attempt to use the democratic process to legitimize her personal vendetta against my RV, but there wasn't much I could do except show up and hope for the best. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland beige building that perfectly captured the soul-crushing aesthetic Nancy seemed to prefer. When I arrived, I was surprised to see nearly 30 people in attendance, which was apparently unprecedented for Pine Valley Estates homeowners meetings. Nancy had clearly been working the phones, calling in favors and spreading fear about the recreational vehicle crisis that was supposedly threatening our neighborhood's very existence. Nancy had prepared for this meeting like she was defending her doctoral thesis. She'd created poster boards with charts, photographs of my RV from every angle, and even prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Her argument was simple but effective. RVs were the gateway to neighborhood decline, property values would plummet, and Pine Valley Estates would transform into a trailer park if immediate action wasn't taken. The crowd murmured nervously, clearly buying into Nancy's apocalyptic vision of RV-induced social collapse. When Nancy finally opened the floor for discussion, I stood up to present my side of the story. I explained that my RV was properly registered, legally parked, and used exactly as intended by the original Homeowners Association covenant. I pointed out that several other neighbors had boats, trailers, and oversized vehicles that somehow escaped Nancy's attention. I even offered to work with the association to develop reasonable guidelines that would address legitimate concerns while preserving property rights. But the damage was already done. Nancy had spent weeks poisoning the well, painting me as an inconsiderate outsider who didn't respect community values. When the vote was called, the comprehensive recreational vehicle regulations passed by a margin of 4 votes to 3. The new rules were breathtakingly specific. RVs could not exceed 25 feet in length, 6 feet 8 inches in height, or remain parked in driveways for more than 4 consecutive hours. They had to be white or beige in color, could not have any external storage compartments, and required written approval from the Homeowners Association for any overnight parking. As I sat in the back row, watching Nancy celebrate her victory with barely contained glee, I realized that this wasn't really about RVs at all. This was about power and control, and Nancy had just demonstrated that she was willing to rewrite the rules of our entire community to win a personal grudge match. The woman had essentially outlawed my specific RV while creating loopholes for everyone else's toys, and she'd convinced the neighbors to help her do it. Frank Delaney, a weathered man in his 50s who owned the property next to our neighborhood, had been sitting quietly in the corner throughout the meeting. As people filed out, he approached me with a knowing look. "That woman tried to buy my land 3 times in the past 2 years," he said quietly, "always offering way below market value, saying she wanted to expand community control beyond the current boundaries. I told her to get lost every time, but now I'm wondering if there might be a better way to handle this situation." He handed me his business card and walked away, leaving me with the distinct impression that Frank Delaney might become a very important ally in whatever came next. The fine notice arrived on Thursday morning, printed on official Pine Valley Estates letterhead and personally delivered by Nancy herself. $500 per day effective immediately for violation of the newly enacted Comprehensive Recreational Vehicle Regulations. I had 24 hours to comply or face escalating penalties that could eventually result in a lien against my property. Nancy stood on my front porch with barely contained excitement, clearly savoring what she considered her moment of ultimate triumph. "I tried to warn you, Mr. Harrington," she said with fake sympathy, "but you chose not to listen. Now you'll have to face the consequences of your actions." She handed me the notice with a flourish, then pulled out her phone to take photos of my non-compliant vehicle for what she called enforcement documentation purposes. As I watched her circle my RV like a shark, measuring and photographing every detail, I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't about community standards or property values anymore. This was pure bullying, and I'd reached my breaking point. By Friday afternoon, I'd been forced to rent a storage unit 15 miles outside town for $200 per month. Loading my RV onto a trailer and watching it disappear down the highway felt like a surrender I'd never quite recover from. Nancy emerged from her house as the tow truck pulled away, clipboard in hand, making notes about what she called compliance verification. She actually waved at me as my RV vanished around the corner, a gesture so smugly triumphant that I wanted to throw something. But Nancy wasn't content with just winning the RV battle. Having tasted victory, she immediately escalated to finding new violations to justify her existence as Pine Valley's self-appointed enforcement officer. She started conducting daily quality inspections of my property, documenting everything from the length of my grass to the number of delivery trucks that visited my house. Within a week, she'd written me up for excessive commercial vehicle traffic because I'd received 3 Amazon deliveries in 2 days and potential home business violation because she'd observed me working at my computer during what she considered normal business hours. The home business accusation was the final straw. Nancy had apparently been monitoring my daily routine and decided that working from home as a computer consultant constituted illegal commercial activity. She filed complaints with the police, the building inspector, the tax assessor's office, and somehow even managed to get the FBI interested in what she described as suspicious activities involving large amounts of computer equipment. Suddenly, I was dealing with investigators from 4 different agencies, all trying to determine whether my legitimate work-from-home job violated some obscure zoning regulation. The investigations consumed 2 full weeks of my life. I had to provide employment records, tax returns, client testimonials, and detailed explanations of what exactly a computer systems consultant does all day. Building inspectors examined my home office to ensure I wasn't running some kind of illegal server farm. Tax officials verified that I was properly reporting my income and paying appropriate business licenses. The FBI agent who showed up seemed genuinely confused about why he was there, but he dutifully documented my computer setup and confirmed that remote work wasn't a federal crime. Through it all, Nancy maintained her daily surveillance routine, taking photos and measurements like she was building a case for the Supreme Court. She'd set up a folding chair on her front lawn with a clear view of my house, and she would sit there for hours with her clipboard and binoculars, documenting every person who visited, every delivery that arrived, and every time I so much as opened my front door. The woman had transformed neighborhood harassment into a full-time occupation. Deputy Whitman's coffee consumption had reached alarming levels by this point. He'd upgraded to what appeared to be a full pot of espresso, and his hands shook slightly as he apologized for the 6th investigation in 2 weeks. "Mr. Harrington, I've been a police officer for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this," he said, glancing nervously toward Nancy's house. "The woman calls us every single day with new complaints, Yesterday, she reported you for suspicious window activity because you opened your blinds at 8 a.m. instead of 7:30. He paused to take a long sip of coffee. I'm not supposed to say this, but you might want to consider legal action. This has gone way beyond normal neighbor dispute. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I found myself sitting alone on my living room floor, surrounded by investigation paperwork and legal documents. I had lost 2 weeks of work defending myself against Nancy's fabricated complaints. My clients were starting to ask questions about my reliability. My stress levels had reached the point where I was having trouble sleeping, and I'd started avoiding my own front windows because I couldn't stand the sight of Nancy conducting her daily surveillance operations. As I sat there, looking through the rain-streaked glass at Nancy's house, I seriously considered just giving up. Selling the house, cutting my losses, and starting over somewhere else seemed like the rational response to this level of harassment. I'd moved to Pine Valley Estates for peace and quiet, not to engage in psychological warfare with a deranged homeowners association president. Maybe Nancy had won after all. But then my phone rang and everything changed. It was Megan Blake, my lawyer friend, calling with what she described as a completely crazy idea that might actually work. As I listened to her explain the legal research she'd been doing on my behalf, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Cal, she said, what if I told you there was a way to not just fight back against Nancy, but to make her regret ever messing with you? And what if I told you it was completely legal? Before I could answer, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Frank Delaney standing on my porch with an expression that suggested he had important news to share. As I opened the door, he got straight to the point. I've been watching what that woman has been doing to you, and I've made a decision. I want to sell my land, and I want to sell it to you. Whatever you're planning to do with it, as long as it annoys Nancy Whitlow, you have my full support. Standing there in my doorway, listening to Frank's offer while Megan explained her legal strategy over the phone, I felt the first spark of genuine excitement I'd experienced since moving to Pine Valley Estates. Nancy had spent months making my life miserable, using every tool of institutional power at her disposal to harass and intimidate me, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd never considered what might happen if someone fought back using the same system she'd been manipulating all along. As I looked across the street at Nancy's house, where she was no doubt planning her next harassment campaign, I realized that the war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, and this time I was going to be the one writing the rules. Frank Delaney's property was exactly what I needed, even though I hadn't realized I needed it until that moment. 5 acres of gently rolling land directly adjacent to Pine Valley Estates, with mature oak trees, a small creek, and most importantly, a clear view of Nancy Whitlow's kitchen window. As Frank walked me around the property the next morning, I began to see possibilities that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. The land's been in my family for 60 years, Frank explained as we stood near the creek. When Pine Valley Estates got built 15 years ago, I thought about developing it myself, but I was getting close to retirement and didn't want the hassle. He paused to look directly at Nancy's house, but that woman has made my life miserable for 3 years straight. Complaining about my farming equipment, reporting me to the health department, trying to get the county to force me to install expensive fencing. If there's a way to legally annoy her while making some money, I'm interested. Megan arrived that afternoon with a briefcase full of research and the kind of excited expression she usually reserved for particularly interesting legal challenges. Cal, this is perfect, she said, spreading documents across Frank's kitchen table. Frank's land is outside the Homeowners Association's jurisdiction completely. Nancy can't control what happens here any more than she can control what happens on the moon. She pulled out a folder and started explaining the possibilities. The more we talked, the more excited I became. The land was perfectly situated for a recreational vehicle campground with easy access to the main road, existing utility connections, and enough space for 20 camping sites. The county had been actively encouraging recreational tourism development, offering streamlined permitting and even tax incentives for new campground businesses. Most importantly, everything we wanted to do was not only legal, but actively supported by local government policies. Here's the beautiful part, Megan explained, pointing to a map. Pine Valley Estates is surrounded by commercially zoned land except for Frank's property, which has been the only thing standing between Nancy's little kingdom and the outside world. She's probably been counting on eventually expanding her control over this land. But if we move fast, we can establish a legitimate business that will be grandfathered in under current laws. We spent the rest of the afternoon developing a strategy that would ensure Nancy never saw our plan coming. Frank would sell me the land through a private transaction that wouldn't require public notification. I would simultaneously apply for all necessary business licenses and permits through different county departments. Megan would handle the legal paperwork to ensure everything was filed correctly. By the time Nancy realized what was happening, the deal would be done and the permits would be approved. The financial arrangements were surprisingly straightforward. Frank was asking a fair market price for agricultural land, which was significantly less than residential property values. My divorce settlement and savings would cover the purchase price, and I could finance the campground development through business loans. More importantly, the projected revenue from a well-run RV campground would easily cover all expenses and provide a substantial return on investment. We decided to keep the entire project secret until all the paperwork was finalized. Frank would continue his normal routine, I would maintain the appearance of defeated compliance with Nancy's rules, and Megan would handle all the legal work without any public filings that might tip Nancy off. The goal was to present Nancy with a fait accompli, a fully permitted, completely legal recreational vehicle campground operating right next door to her precious Pine Valley estate. Over the next 2 weeks, while Nancy continued her daily surveillance routine and celebrated her apparent victory over my RV, we quietly assembled one of the most satisfying revenge plots I'd ever been part of. County officials were enthusiastic about the campground proposal, environmental studies came back clean, and the business license applications sailed through the approval process. Every potential legal challenge was anticipated and addressed. The only tense moment came when Nancy apparently noticed increased activity around Frank's property and started conducting what she called perimeter reconnaissance missions. She would drive slowly past the property line, taking photos and trying to figure out what was happening. At one point, she actually trespassed onto Frank's land to get closer photos of survey stakes, which Frank documented with his own camera system. The final piece fell into place on a Thursday morning when I received confirmation that all permits had been approved and recorded with the county. Pine Valley RV Campground was officially authorized to begin operations, with full utilities, bathroom facilities, and 20 recreational vehicle sites, with electrical, water, and sewer hookups. The county had even approved our request for a large entrance sign visible from the main road. That evening, I sat in my living room looking across at Nancy's house, where she was conducting her usual evening surveillance activities. In less than 24 hours, I would present her with the biggest surprise of her miserable life. After months of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power, Nancy Whitlow was about to discover that sometimes the best revenge is serving it up completely legally and with proper permits. Tuesday evening's homeowners association meeting was supposed to be a routine monthly gathering, but I had plans to make it memorable. I arrived 15 minutes late, carrying a manila folder and wearing the biggest smile I'd managed in months. Nancy was in the middle of presenting her monthly neighborhood compliance report when I walked in, and the look of confusion on her face was priceless. For weeks, I'd been the defeated enemy, the broken neighbor who'd been forced to comply with her ridiculous rules. My sudden appearance with what appeared to be important documents clearly threw off her rhythm. As I was saying, Nancy continued, glancing nervously in my direction, community standards remain high thanks to our vigilant enforcement of established regulations. The recreational vehicle situation has been resolved, and we've successfully maintained the aesthetic integrity that makes Pine Valley Estates special. She was practically glowing with self-satisfaction as she described her victory over my RV, completely unaware that her world was about to change dramatically. When Nancy finished her presentation and opened the floor for new business, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I have an announcement that I think everyone will find interesting, I said, placing my manila folder on the table and pulling out a thick stack of official documents. I wanted to personally inform my neighbors about a new business venture that will be opening right next door to Pine Valley Estate. The room went completely silent as I spread the permits and licenses across the table where everyone could see them. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to announce the grand opening of Pine Valley RV Campground, a full-service recreational vehicle park located on the former Delaney property. Nancy's face went through several color changes as I continued. We'll be offering 20 premium RV sites with full hookups, bathroom and shower facilities, laundry services, and high-speed wireless internet. Our grand opening is scheduled for this coming Saturday. The silence in the room was so complete that you could hear the air conditioning humming. Nancy stared at the permits like they were written in a foreign language, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Finally, she managed to sputter, "That's impossible. That land isn't zoned for commercial use." I smiled politely and pointed to the relevant permit. Actually, it's zoned for recreational and agricultural use, which makes an RV campground not only legal but encouraged by county development policies. Nancy grabbed the permits and started reading frantically, looking for some mistake or loophole that would invalidate what I'd just announced. But Megan had done her job perfectly. Every document was properly filed, every requirement met, every potential objection anticipated and addressed. "This can't be legal," Nancy shouted, her voice rising to a pitch that made several people wince. "I'm calling the county planning office first thing tomorrow morning." "Please do," I replied calmly. "They'll be happy to confirm that Pine Valley RV Campground is fully permitted and ready to begin operations. In fact, the county development office is planning to feature us in their recreational tourism brochure." This last detail, which was absolutely true, seemed to drain what little color remained from Nancy's face. The idea that government officials were actually celebrating my campground was clearly more than her control-obsessed mind could process. The rest of the meeting devolved into chaos as Nancy demanded emergency motions, special investigations, and immediate legal action to stop what she kept calling this travesty. But her fellow board members seemed more interested in learning about the potential benefits of having a well-run campground next door than in supporting Nancy's hysteria. Several neighbors asked practical questions about noise levels, traffic patterns, and whether campground guests would have access to neighborhood amenities. Their concerns were reasonable, and their tone was civil, a stark contrast to Nancy's increasingly unhinged demands for immediate action. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for a grand opening. I'd hired a professional banner company to create a massive sign reading Pine Valley RV Camp, "Round up all RVs welcome," in bright red letters visible from half a mile away. The sign was positioned so that Nancy would see it every time she looked out her kitchen window, a daily reminder that her reign of neighborhood terror had finally met its match. The campground's first customer arrived at exactly 9 a.m., a retired couple from Arizona driving a 35-foot motorhome that was almost identical to my banned RV. They were delighted with the facilities, the location, and especially the reasonable nightly rates. As I helped them get connected to utilities, I noticed Nancy watching from her front window with binoculars, documenting the arrival of the exact type of vehicle she'd spent months trying to eliminate from her site. By noon, 12 of our 20 sites were occupied, and people were calling to make reservations for the following weekend. Word was spreading quickly through RV traveler networks about our clean facilities, friendly service, and convenient location. The guests were exactly the kind of responsible, well-behaved people I'd hoped to attract. Retirees exploring the country, families on vacation, and weekend adventurers looking for a peaceful place to park their rigs. Nancy's response to our success was predictably dramatic. She organized what she called a Save Our Neighborhood protest, which consisted of herself and one confused neighbor holding handmade signs on the sidewalk outside our entrance. Her signs, made with poster board and magic markers, read, "Stop the Invasion" and "Protect Pine Valley," and she'd somehow convinced herself that local media would be interested in covering her one-woman demonstration. The protest reached its peak absurdity when Nancy attempted to perform a citizen's arrest on our third customer, an elderly gentleman from Oklahoma who was simply trying to park his travel trailer. She marched up to his window and announced that he was trespassing on a residential neighborhood and demanded that he submit to detention pending police arrival. The poor man was so confused that he started reaching for his cell phone to call for help, which prompted Nancy to start shouting about resisting arrest. Fortunately, Deputy Whitman arrived at that moment for what had become his daily campground wellness check. He'd been stopping by every morning with his coffee, partly to ensure everything was running smoothly, and partly because our campground coffee was apparently better than what they served at the police station. "Ma'am," he said to Nancy, with the patient tone of someone who dealt with her many times before, "you can't arrest people for legally using a permitted business. And if you don't stop harassing our customers, I'm going to have to arrest you for disturbing the peace." The look on Nancy's face as Deputy Whitman threatened to arrest her instead of my customers was absolutely priceless. Her entire worldview seemed to crumble as she realized that the law enforcement officer she'd been calling daily for months was now protecting the very people she wanted removed. She stood there sputtering for a few seconds, then gathered up her protest signs and stormed back to her house, muttering threats about lawyers and lawsuits and fighting this injustice all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. As the sun set on our first day of operation, I stood next to our entrance sign watching families gather around campfires and retirees enjoying the peaceful evening. The sight of happy people relaxing in their RVs doing exactly what Nancy had tried so hard to prevent filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't expected. This wasn't just revenge anymore, it was justice. Nancy had abused her power to make my life miserable, and now she was discovering that actions have consequences. From my position near the entrance, I could see Nancy silhouetted in her kitchen window, no doubt planning her next move in what she probably still considered a winnable war. But as I looked around at our thriving campground, our satisfied customers, and our completely legal operation, I realized that Nancy had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. Nancy's counterattack came exactly 1 week after our grand opening, delivered in the form of a lawsuit filed by the most expensive law firm in the county. The complaint was a masterpiece of legal desperation, claiming that Pine Valley RV Campground constituted a public nuisance, caused irreparable harm to residential property values, and violated numerous zoning regulations that the lawyers had apparently made up on the spot. Nancy was seeking an immediate injunction to shut down our operation, plus damages for what she claimed was destruction of neighborhood character. The local newspaper picked up the story, and suddenly our little neighborhood dispute became a matter of public interest. "Local woman sues over RV campground," read the headline, with a photo of Nancy holding one of her handmade protest signs. The article presented both sides of the story fairly, but the comments section was overwhelmingly supportive of the campground. People appreciated having new recreational facilities in the area, and Nancy's reputation for neighborhood harassment had apparently preceded her into the court of public opinion. Megan was thrilled with the lawsuit, which surprised me until she explained her strategy. "Cal, this is exactly what we wanted," she said, spreading Nancy's legal filings across her conference table. "By filing this lawsuit, Nancy has opened herself up to discovery, which means we get to examine all of her records, all of her communications, and all of her financial dealings as HOA president. And based on what I've already found in public records, I think Nancy has been very, very stupid with other people's money." The discovery process revealed exactly what Megan had suspected. Nancy had been systematically embezzling money from the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association Fund for over 2 years. The evidence was overwhelming and remarkably sloppy. She'd used HOA funds to pay her personal attorney fees, reimburse herself for fake community improvement expenses, and even cover her monthly car payments by claiming her vehicle was used for official HOA business. In total, she'd stolen nearly $15,000 from her neighbor's maintenance fund. But the embezzlement was just the beginning of what we discovered. Nancy's records revealed a pattern of harassment that went far beyond what she'd done to me. She'd targeted at least 6 different neighbors over the past 3 years, filing false complaints, making frivolous police reports, and using her HOA position to intimidate anyone who disagreed with her. She'd even kept detailed files on each of her targets, complete with photos, surveillance notes, and what appeared to be psychological profiles. The most damaging evidence came from Nancy's own computer, which contained dozens of emails between her and her attorney discussing strategies for eliminating undesirable elements from Pine Valley Estates. In one particularly incriminating message, Nancy had written, "I don't care if it's legal or not, I want that RV owner gone by whatever means necessary." Her lawyer had responded with advice on how to creatively interpret HOA regulations to achieve her goals. As word of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood, something interesting happened. People started coming forward with their own Nancy horror stories. The woman who'd been reported for having non-conforming garden gnomes. The family who'd been harassed for parking their teenager's car in their own driveway. The elderly man who'd been fined for having his newspaper delivered too early in the morning. Everyone had a Nancy story, and none of them were flattering. The Emergency Homeowners Association meeting to address the lawsuit was standing room only. Nancy arrived with her attorney and a briefcase full of documents, clearly expecting to present her case to a sympathetic audience of neighbors who shared her outrage about the campground. Instead, she faced a room full of people who'd been waiting years for someone to finally challenge her abuse of power. Nancy's presentation was a 90-minute PowerPoint extravaganza titled "Saving Pine Valley Estates from Commercial Invasion." She had charts showing alleged property value declines, photos of RV damage to community aesthetics, and even a detailed analysis of increased traffic patterns. Her lawyer nodded approvingly as she presented what they clearly believed was an airtight case for shutting down the campground and collecting substantial damages. When Nancy finished her presentation and asked for questions, the room erupted. But instead of the supportive outrage she'd expected, Nancy faced a barrage of accusations about her own behavior. Neighbors demanded to know why HOA funds were being used to pay her personal legal bills. People wanted explanations for the mysterious community improvement expenses that no one had ever seen. Several residents produced copies of harassment complaints they'd filed against Nancy that had been ignored by the HOA board. The meeting's turning point came when Megan stood up and calmly requested permission to respond to Nancy's allegations. She presented a brief overview of what discovery had revealed: the embezzlement, the harassment files, the abuse of power, and the systematic intimidation of anyone who disagreed with Nancy's increasingly authoritarian management style. The room fell completely silent as Megan displayed bank records showing exactly how Nancy had been stealing from her neighbor's trust fund. Nancy's response was a complete meltdown that destroyed whatever credibility she had left. She started screaming about conspiracies and outside agitators and people who don't understand what it takes to maintain community standards. She accused me of bribing county officials, claimed that Megan was part of some kind of legal conspiracy, and even suggested that her fellow HOA board members were being blackmailed into opposing her. The more Nancy talked, the worse she made things for herself. She admitted to using HOA funds for personal expenses, justified her surveillance activities as necessary security measures, and defended her harassment campaigns as protecting property values. By the time security guards had to escort her from the building, Nancy had essentially confessed to every accusation against her, while simultaneously alienating everyone who might have supported her. The vote to remove Nancy from her HOA position was unanimous. The vote to elect me as the new president was nearly as decisive. My first official act was to repeal every one of Nancy's creative interpretations of the original Homeowners Association covenant, returning Pine Valley Estates to the reasonable community standards that had existed before Nancy's reign of terror began. 6 months later, Pine Valley RV Campground is booked solid through next summer. We've been featured in 3 different RV travel magazines, and the county has asked us to serve as a model for other recreational tourism developments. Nancy was forced to sell her house to pay back the money she'd stolen, plus legal fees and penalties. She moved to Florida, though I heard through Frank that she's already caused problems with her new homeowners association down there. Every morning, I have my coffee on the campground's front porch, watching happy families start their day in their RVs parked exactly where Nancy once tried so hard to ban them. My own RV sits proudly in my driveway under a new neighborhood sign that reads, Pine Valley Estates, Community, Not Control. Deputy Whitman stops by occasionally for coffee and to update me on how much quieter his job has become since Nancy moved away. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if Nancy had just minded her own business and let me park my RV in peace. I would have continued living quietly in Pine Valley Estates, taking my weekend camping trips and bothering no one. But Nancy's harassment taught me something important. Bullies only have as much power as we give them, and sometimes the best response to abuse of authority is to take that authority away completely. Looking back, I'm almost grateful to Nancy Whitlow. Her harassment campaign backfired so spectacularly that she ended up creating exactly the opposite of what she wanted. Instead of eliminating RVs from her site, she forced me to build a business that puts dozens of RVs right outside her former kitchen window every single day. Instead of maintaining her grip on neighborhood power, she lost everything and had to leave town in disgrace. And instead of making my life miserable, she inadvertently helped me build something I'm genuinely proud of. The lesson here is simple. If someone tries to use institutional power to bully you, don't just fight back within their system. Build a better system. Nancy wanted to control everything she could see from her window, but now everyone can see what real freedom looks like, and they're paying for the privilege. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't getting even. It's winning so completely that your enemy has no choice but to surrender.
Thanks for riding the emotional roller coaster with QA Stories. Buckle up, the next one's even twistier.